Welcome to the video on Intro to Internal Combustion Engines. This lesson objective is to describe the components of the engine cooling system. So let's do an overview of the engine cooling system in general. So I have a small picture here on the right-hand side. We're going to blow it up on the next slide and go into a little bit more detail. But energy from a typical internal combustion engine has about a 30% usage, about a 30% efficiency. So where does all that extra energy go? Well, the remaining 70% of energy is waste heat. And about half of that waste heat is pushed out of your vehicle via the exhaust, out of the tailpipe. But about half of it raises the engine temperature or is transferred out of the system via the radiator. So what's the purpose of the engine cooling system? Well, obviously it's going to get really, really hot if we don't get it out of there, and it's going to melt our engines. So we want to transfer that waste engine heat out of the system so we can maintain a desired operating temperature based on the material properties of our engine. We can also use that engine heat, though, to heat the cabin as well. So generally, we want to keep the operating temperatures around 200 degrees Fahrenheit. Now, that's not a rule. It really depends on your vehicle, but that's a general range there just to give you an idea of does the answer make sense. Okay, this lowers the oil viscosity and reduces the engine. All right, now let's just take a look at components. So I've blown up that picture you see on the top right-hand side from Encyclopedia Britannica. And we're just going to work our way around. So we have passageways that go along and around the cylinders for the coolant to flow. Now that coolant is a mix of antifreeze and water. If you live in an environment where the temperature drops below freezing, you don't want that water to freeze up and crack your cylinder heads or freeze up and jam up your radiator. So we have an antifreeze in there that prevents freezing. It's typically a 50-50 mix of water and antifreeze. So if you overheat somewhere, you can always add water if you were in an emergency. There's a water pump that circulates that antifreeze and water through the jacket to cool the cylinders. And you have a thermostat that's going to regulate that flow of water. If the engine gets too hot, then it's going to increase that flow. If it's too cold, then it's not going to push as much fluid through it. So in the front, you have a radiator, and that radiator is essentially a liquid to air heat exchanger where you have the hot fluid coming from the engine and the cold air that's being drawn in through the radiator. That radiator has fins so that it increases the surface area to increase the transfer rate. Now, to draw that air through the radiator, some of that is pushed naturally through the car propelling forward. But what about if you're idle, you're stopped, or you're at a slow velocity? Well, you have a fan that's going to draw that airflow in to increase the mass flow rate of that air and to cool that coolant or that antifreeze in water that is now very, very hot until it gets to the bottom where it gets recirculated around the cylinders. I like this image here on this next slide because it shows a thermal mapping of that hot fluid, and as it gradually goes down the radiator, it gets cooler and gets cycled back in the engine. But more importantly, I want to show this tie-off here where you have hot antifreeze and water being run through a smaller air to liquid heat exchanger, or a liquid to air heat exchanger, I should say, and then cycling back in for either use in the coolant or it'll get cycled through the process through the radiator. Well, what is this guy? That is what you call a heater core, and this little fan is drawing external air in, pushing that air past and heating it up, and that's how you heat the cabin. And let me tell you, most of these are not in an easy place to fix. Typically, they require removing most, if not all, of your dashboard, so just hope you never have a failure in your heater core. Okay, that wraps it up for this lesson objective. If you have any questions, contact your instructor.